U.S. President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are set to hold talks on the sidelines of the United Nations Assembly in New York rather than at the White House, a move attributed by U.S. officials to technical reasons. The meeting is scheduled for September 20th. Here's more. U.S. President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are scheduled to meet on the sidelines of the United Nations Assembly in New York and not at the White House. The absence of a meeting in Washington between the two leaders has been explained by U.S. officials as a technical matter. However, others suggest that Biden aims to avoid the impression of business as usual, having previously criticized Netanyahu's government as the most extreme he can recall and expressing concerns over judicial reforms. Just 1 month ago, the two engaged in a warm and lengthy conversation, according to a statement from Netanyahu's office. They emphasized strengthening the alliance between the countries, addressing threats from Iran and its allies, expanding regional peace efforts, and maintaining stability in Judea and Samaria. This as Biden extended an invitation to Netanyahu for a future U.S. meeting. Meanwhile, as Netanyahu prepares to attend the UN General Assembly next week, protests against the legal reform in Israel have been projected onto the New York UN building with messages such as "Don't believe Prime Minister Netanyahu, protect Israeli democracy." The UN headquarters has condemned the behavior of the demonstrators, but cited a lack of control over security issues outside the building. As for Netanyahu's U.S. visit schedule, he is expected to meet with leaders in the field of artificial intelligence in California before heading to New York for the UN General Assembly. His speech is scheduled for next Friday, and he will return to Israel shortly after, just before the Yom Kippur fast begins. And joining me here with more on the reported Biden-Netanyahu meeting is ILTV's Steve Leibovich. Steve, good to have you as always.
Pleasure.
Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is finally getting his meeting with President Joe Biden. He must be relieved, can we say that?
It only took 9 months. He was expecting it the day after taking office in Israel, as would be a tradition, let's say, for a good friend and leader of the most important strategic ally of the United States. But the invitation had not come, and it's still not really come. The Prime Minister's office has released a tentative schedule, and they've left a hole for the meeting with Biden. Apparently, it is going to be filled in, and there will be a meeting, but not in the White House, which is where Netanyahu would love to have that meeting because of all that it implies, rather on the sidelines of the United Nations.
So really, the meeting is going to take place in the United Nations. The United States are saying that it's a technical issue, which sounds really interesting. Why not at the White House? What's happening? It's the real deal.
Very technical, talking about hundreds of miles between Washington. And if there was an interest by Biden to have Netanyahu visit the White House, the meeting would take place in Washington. Netanyahu would much prefer it. And the reasons are because of all that it brings with it. It shows that this is a major strategic ally. Netanyahu would use the opportunity to make major announcements about cooperation between Israel and the United States. And he would want everything to seem like it's normal, relations are going well between the two countries, when we know that behind the scenes, there's quite a lot of tension.
Now, you know, Netanyahu is on a series of diplomatic state visits. He's been to Cyprus. He has a lot more in store. The United States is pretty much, the biggest one he has soon. What are the issues on the agenda Netanyahu wants to discuss, wants to talk about with Biden there and other officials?
Netanyahu would love to be discussing things like the Saudi normalization, the big prize. He would love to be discussing the Iran nuclear deal and all of Israel's concerns about that. He'd love to be making his rounds around the Senate with all of his friends, especially the Republican senators and some Democrats who he's good friends with, and to show that Israel and Netanyahu are welcome commodities in Washington, when we've seen that all of his ministers until now have been shunted because the United States is upset. They don't like the composition of this government. They don't like the judicial reforms. They don't like some of the moves that have been taken about settlement activity. Basically, there's not very much that they like about this government, and Biden's way of saying so is by saying, I'll meet you on the sidelines of the UN like I would do with, let's say, the leader of Hungary.
Yes, that's really interesting. Now, how long is that going to last? I mean, is Biden pretty much saying, you're not doing what I want, this is what's going to happen in the near future and in general in the future?
You can't predict, and there's a new ambassador coming from the United States. We're not positive who it's going to be, but it looks like it's going to be someone that is going to be just as critical as Biden is and his predecessor was. I think that unless there's some major steps taken by Netanyahu, the relations between Biden administration and Netanyahu will remain cool. Major steps, I mean, a gesture to the Palestinians towards Saudi normalization. It's not just going to come with Israel sitting on the sideline and saying, it'll come to us because we deserve it. The United States is expecting some real offers by Israel, compromises about the Palestinians, and it's also expecting Netanyahu to rein in his ministers, which Biden has described as being extremists.
Yes, it's not going to be easy for Netanyahu. Now, Steve, you're hosting The Insider tonight. What's the topic, which is completely different this time, right? And who are the guests?
It's the year-ender. That was the year that was. And we're going to go over some of the highlights of the year. Obviously, I have a great guest, editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel, David Hurwitz, on my program for the first time. And he is a brilliant guy. I would say he's the smartest English-language journalist in the country. Wow. He comes on and lays it out, everything you ever wanted to know, the important parts about judicial reform, David Hurwitz. And backing him up was Dr. Gerald Steinberg, one of the leading political scientists in the country and a top political negotiator, trying to find a solution.
That's interesting. So we'll definitely tune in. Thank you so much for joining, Steve, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
It's a dramatic day politically, with the High Court meeting to consider the legality of the reasonableness law. You have been following latest developments and the background of the story. Let's give it a listen.
Protesters for and against government-proposed judicial reform have been demonstrating outside the High Court as the full panel of 15 justices consider the legality of the reasonableness law passed by the Netanyahu-led coalition government. The momentous and extraordinary nature of this clash was highlighted by the sight of all 15 justices of the High Court assembled for the first time in a panel of this size. On one side, petitioners from government watchdog and civil society organizations argued that the Basic Law Amendment passed in July limits the court's ability to judge government decisions based on a doctrine of reasonableness and does severe damage to Israel's democracy. On the other side is the government, insisting that the court has no right of judicial review over quasi-constitutional basic laws. The government also insists that the law justly limits the High Court, that has become too powerful. The High Court is left to decide on its own fate. In the past, the court asserted its right to review basic laws under limited circumstances. Now it must decide if the terms of the reasonableness law warrant the use of the so-called doomsday weapon of striking down legislation of constitutional nature. As an amendment to basic law of the judiciary, the reasonableness law bans all courts, including the Supreme Court, from deliberating and ruling against government and ministerial decisions on the basis of judicial standards of reasonableness. The reasonableness standard had allowed the Supreme Court to annul government and ministerial decisions if the court believed that the decision was based on unreasonable considerations.
It's been a tense political day, and joining us now is advocate Ran Bar Yoshafat from the Kohelet Forum. Ran, is it even legitimate that the High Court consider a basic law, and even more so, a basic law relating to its own powers?
Well, in my opinion, the answer is a big no. In the Mizrahi verdict in the mid-90s, the Supreme Court of Israel had a theoretical question, which it should not even address, in my opinion, because that's not the place of courts to decide if Israel has or doesn't have a constitution. And basically the court said that basic laws are somewhat of a constitution, even though the main difference between a basic law and a regular law is just that it says basic law in the beginning of the name of the law, the headline.